Hey, I'm back after a little sojourn in France, of which I have some footage which I might work into a little video for you depending on how nasty it is to edit. We'll see. But in the meantime, here I am in my parents' house, reunited with my old books. And I thought it's a good opportunity to, kind of show you some of the books that made me, the most formative ones that I could find here. In a top 10 list. So let's go. Starting with The Lord of the Rings. This edition also has The Hobbit inside, this little box set. And these are the originals that I read when I was a kid. Well, I read that my dad read me The Hobbit, and then he started reading The Fellowship to me as a child, and at some point I kind of took over. There's The Fellowship. But yeah, this is like my first book, I think. I was always into books before, the big kind of Hungry Caterpillar style things. This was probably like the first non-picture book. This is probably the first like piece of literature which I read, I think. And yeah, like I said, my dad started reading it to me and I continued reading it. As well as kind of being my first book, I would say this is largely responsible for my moral upbringing, kind of my Catholic upbringing. Not so much because of what Tolkien himself put into the book as a Catholic. He kind of shaped his fantasy around his Catholicism in lots of ways, but more because of the way that my father, who was brought up in a Catholic atmosphere but like is an atheist, would use this, I think, as a sort of way to sort of secularize morality, I think, for his kids. If I fell over and hurt my knee or something, my dad would probably say like, oh, well, remember Frodo going through Mordor. Think of that suffering and your suffering becomes little by comparison. So yeah, Frodo was my Jesus, and this is the result. Praise Elendil. Next up is Jingo. Terry Pratchett is a sort of one of the transition authors for me from kids fantasy into like more grown-up things. A few books of his were like that for me, but this was his first Discworld that I read. The Discworld fantasy novels are more geared towards adults. I would not recommend anyone start the Discworld series through Jingo. It's not the most famous one. I don't think it's the most gripping one. It's about war, as you might be able to tell from the name. It's a kind of a fantasy Western society fighting a fantasy Middle Eastern society. And as a kid, all that stuff went over my head. So much of this went over my head. I did not understand probably half of what I was reading, but it had werewolves. And it had, it was set in a world which is a flat disc on the back of 4 elephants on the back of a giant turtle flying through the universe. Swimming through the universe, I guess. But anyway, it had these fantasy things which kept me interested and going, and I was involved with a world I didn't understand. This introduced me to stuff like politics. It introduced me to cross-dressing. There was all sorts of things which my tiny brain did not comprehend, but was like, ooh, this is new. This is interesting. So yeah, absolutely, this book was one of the big stepping stones for me going from childhood to adulthood. Kiss Kiss by Roald Dahl was another one. Like Terry Pratchett, Roald Dahl is famous for both works for adults and for children. I'd read his children's books, or at least some of them, and really enjoyed things like George's Marvelous Medicine and Matilda and so on, right? Kiss Kiss is really dark, and his kid stuff is pretty dark as well, but of George's Marvelous Medicine is like a kid making all these concoctions to feed to his grandmother, and then she turns into a giant, and then she shrinks into a mouse, and all these things happen. Then in Kiss Kiss it's just straight up cyanide, right? These are for adult stories. There's sex, there's death, there's all the adult stuff. It's also got some fantastical elements in it. There's a sci-fi-ish one where a guy dies, but he's in this experimental thing where they preserve his brain and one eyeball, and they keep him alive. So they keep his consciousness is alive in the brain and the eyeball, so he can see out of one eye, but he can't blink or anything like that, right? And obviously he can't speak. And then the story is about his wife, and it's quite bitter, and yeah, a lot of these are quite venomous little stories which are really fun. And I think I was probably a teenager, or going into my teen years when I read this. I definitely didn't have the comprehension issues that I had with Jingo, but I think the connection to reading in a familiar voice, right? Recognizing Roald Dahl as a person from my childhood also helped kind of shepherd me from childhood reading into adulthood reading. Now we get to the big one, and unfortunately I don't have the original copy that I read at the time of The Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde. I found this thing in the house, which I actually don't think I've ever seen before. It's an old everyman's book which I don't know where it came from or who it originally belonged to, but it has the picture of Dorian Gray in it, so I'm just gonna hold it. And a kind of freaky picture of Oscar Wilde there, I think. I read it in high school. It wasn't assigned reading. I just read it for myself because I guess it was in the house somewhere, and I was experimenting with spooky stuff probably at the time. I don't know if it was my first. It must have been my first Gothic novel, I think. It's probably what started that whole thing for me. But yeah, I don't know what happened. But yeah, I have a clear memory of like being so profoundly affected by that book at one point, like just putting it down and picking up a pencil and breaking the pencil in half and just spending like, I don't know, a good 5 minutes on it and like kind of thinking about sensation and about power and about all these like ideas that, you know, kids don't think about. So basically it made me hit puberty. The book just like threw me into adolescence. It made me think things, feel things that I had never thought or felt before. And it's good because although the story is, as most people know, about a guy who has a painting done of himself and he wants to stay young, so the painting will age and also be sort of corrupted by sin while he stays young and beautiful. The book is also about like the development of his personality, right? So like while he is physically youthful and apparently innocent looking, like frozen in time, at the same time he's sort of being corrupted by an older man called Lord Henry, who is just spouting all these aphorisms and like philosophizing and like kind of trying to lead him through a path of decadence and like just living life to satisfy yourself. And I don't really remember, to be honest, like the depths of it. Kind of the philosophy that Wilde espoused, but given a sort of satanic sheen where it feels a little bit diabolical, right? And we can see that it's making Dorian into a bad person. And at the end of it as well, he receives a book, like a French book to do with the aesthetic art for art's sake movement that was happening at the time. And Dorian becomes obsessed with this book and he gets like it bound in different colors, and so he decorates his bookshelf with the same book but like in different colors and stuff. And he says to Lord Henry at the end of the book, you poisoned me with a book once, I shouldn't forgive that. So I was reading it being like, oh my god, I'm being poisoned by this book just like he was being poisoned by that book. So through that sort of metafictional paralleling, I became aware for the first time that books can mess with my brain and they can like help me develop and grow into something more interesting than I am right now, and I wanted that. So I guess like self-awareness about reading and like kind of why I wanted to read began also with the picture of Dorian Gray. And from then on I thought, okay, not only do I want to read like classics, and I wanted to read like philosophical books, and I had this sense that reading should be something which is like not good for you, but like something which develops your mind. Like I only wanted to read books which developed myself in some way or form. It made me high and I wanted more. Enter Julio Cortázar. This isn't the book. I couldn't find the original one that I read. This is one that I got later when I was living in Japan. But it includes lots of the same famous short stories. He's an Argentinian writer who wrote like the best short stories ever, basically. There's a lot of abstract identity shifting things. Like there's a story about a guy who is obsessed with axolotls, and so he goes to the aquarium in the zoo every day to look at the axolotls, and then he turns into an axolotl. The reason that it's good is because how he turns into the axolotl, like the way it's written, it's about like a sort of a mental thing where you kind of wonder, did he just go crazy maybe? Or was there actually something magical? It doesn't feel like a Harry Potter sort of pa-ting, you turn into an axolotl. It feels like he had reached some deep level of connection and thought with the animal, and that is what created a sort of a shift in consciousness where it's not really a transformation yet, like his mind ends up in the axolotl and something is left in his body, and you don't, did they swap or did they, it's just intriguing and thoughtful and macabre as well, right? Like he was really influenced by Edgar Allan Poe, and he describes, I think, the axolotl guy is like, I've been buried alive inside an axolotl or something like that. So there's a sort of a degree of horror or claustrophobia which appears throughout these stories, like a kind of a sense of powerlessness as well, which I think probably appealed to me a lot. My dad did a master's in Latin American literature and culture or something like that. But yeah, when I was growing up, there was always a lot of Latin American literature around the house, of which I didn't really read anything, I think, except for the Cortázar. That was my bread and butter. And similar to Kiss Kiss by Roald Dahl, I think I kind of got the idea that this is just like peak. This is what writing should be. And my own kind of writing from that time also is sort of a mashup of Roald Dahl and Julio Cortázar. But like what this has that's different is this sense of like, you know, a lot of these stories are like mundane things leading to a complete loss of identity or a gaining of a different identity. The world is such a dangerously malleable place that you could easily lose yourself or like become someone else, you know, at the drop of a hat. There's a character who gets lost in his dreams. There's another one who meets a young boy who he has reason to believe is his own future reincarnation of himself. And I think just that instability and the sort of the creepy potentials of daily life and human identity and the way they kind of mash up together was just incredibly appealing to me. And it's probably set, I think also the way that this shaped me is that it set a baseline for strangeness, which was probably quite different from a lot of my peers and the people around me. And it's happened a bunch of times in my life that I'll be doing something or saying something which for me seems perfectly ordinary and rational and whatever. But somebody will comment that it's quite strange, or that's a little weird, Seb. And, you know, that used to surprise me quite a lot because I thought I was just being chill, you know? But now I know it's probably Cortázar's fault. Moving on to the only work of philosophy on this list. This is Proust and Signs by Deleuze. After Dorian Gray broke my brain, I went to university in Warwick in the UK to study philosophy and literature. And I learned I liked literature a lot more than philosophy, but this was the one philosophy book which really had an impact on me. And ironically, this book of philosophy is an analysis of a work of literature, In Search of Lost Time by Marcel Proust. And that work of literature was the only assigned reading that I didn't read, I think, because like there were just so many and I had to lose one of them, and that one was really long, and I read up to the bit where he eats the biscuit, the Madeline, right? And I thought that's really good, but outside of that I was pretty bored, so I thought, okay, this is getting the chop, and I didn't read anything beyond the beginning of the first book in Search of Lost Time, whatever that's called. Swan's Way, Swan something with a swan in it. Anyway, the French philosopher Gilles Deleuze obviously liked that book, and he wrote about scenes in that book, about the Madeline and so on. I won't get into the philosophy because I would butcher it here, but this book was in a way a corrective to the impression that I got from Dorian Gray, because it made me realize that philosophy wasn't something that I wanted to learn by like shoving into my brain. Like it's something that I myself can like kind of gain mastery over new ways of thinking. Rather, after reading this, I just saw the world differently. I experienced stuff differently. I understood impressions and sensations differently because of how it was explained to me here. And it wasn't like a cognitive thing. It just suddenly things clicked, and I understood like memory and sensation in a different way. And I didn't just understand it, I felt it different. But yeah, a lot of the concepts in this book about like signs and art and apprenticeships and essences and love, there's a lot on love in this. Like a lot of that is just how I understand my own feelings and my own experience of being alive. So that's pretty cool. In case it's not obvious, this list is, to the best of my ability, in chronological order of influence. But this middle section, I'm a little bit hazy, so I may have gotten one or two out of order. But this, I know exactly when I read it. The Wind-Up Bird Chronicle by Haruki Murakami. It was after my first year of university. I was 19. I went to China to travel for 2 months. And this was my reading companion for the trip. Haruki Murakami, I feel now, is someone that is good to read like when you're at that age, like late teens, early 20s. That's when I read him, so maybe that's why I'm kind of biased. But like I feel like I'm not interested really in his way of writing or his world so much anymore. I should probably go back at some point, but this was my first Murakami. I don't know why or how I got it. It's about a Japanese guy who he loses his cat, and then he loses his wife, and he's looking for his cat and his wife, and a lot of weird stuff happens. He has to like go down a well and sit at the bottom of the well and go through these like kind of little psychological puzzles where he might die, and that lasts like a big chunk of the novel somewhere in there. There's like mysterious like kind of empty signifiers where like somebody gives him a bottle of whiskey or something, like an empty bottle. No, the box of the bottle of whiskey. But the box has some sort of meaning that he doesn't understand, but it's connected to a guy who was in World War II and blah, blah, blah. The Wind Up Bird Chronicle is for me the perfect example of the right book at the right time, because the reason I went to China was partially because a lot of my very best friends who were Japanese had quite skewed visions of China, and I thought that was strange and I wanted to learn more about China. So I thought best way to do it is go to China and talk to Chinese people, right? It might seem counterproductive that I was reading a Japanese book while I was doing that, but little did I know that actually this book is connected to World War II and the Japanese presence in China. There's a whole theme of war trauma and guilt, and that's kind of clinging to ordinary Japanese people in their daily life, which is part of this book. And maybe like my memory sort of enhanced that more, because this is a sort of book where you can, look for clues and try and figure things out for yourself. And I had a whole notebook which I devoted to just taking notes on this and putting my thoughts. I think that's the only time like I have written a whole book like of notes like by hand while reading another book, like I was writing footnotes for myself almost. And the reason that was so fun to do is because this is very much like about the unconscious. And I was also at that time getting into psychoanalysis, which we'd learned a bit in the first year of university, right? So I was starting to be like, what is all this Freud stuff? This is amazing. And that was really shaping also like how I thought about the world. And I was starting to get into like Asian history, because I was like, what actually happened? Why do people think the way they do about China and about Japan and so on? And this book just brought it all together for me. So I would say, as well as like satisfying those threads that I was following at that point through like the labyrinth of life, this like solidified them and made them more interesting for me and made me think this is the kind of stuff I want to keep learning about. So in that way, it wasn't just like it satisfied the need for what I wanted at that particular moment, but it ensured that I kept going along a certain path. Now, I don't have Crime and Punishment by Fyodor Dostoevsky, which was another big one, another required reading, but I do have The Double and the Gambler, which is I think the only Dostoevsky book I own now. But this is going to stand in for Crime and Punishment because Crime and Punishment was required reading for my university course, and that was also a sort of a corrective in a way to my impression of literature that I'd gotten from The Picture of Dorian Gray. Because after Dorian Gray, I had the impression that classics were these big, difficult, complex like beasts that I had to sort of tackle to get the magic that they had and shove it into my brain so that I could develop myself, as a person. And, with that sort of abstract title, Crime and Punishment, just putting concepts in your title and being a Russian novel, it just felt like this is going to be like a monumental undertaking, right? Which I may not like, I may not get anything out of it, but it's still going to be like a lot of work that I need to put in to sort of like grow my brain, It was a page turner. Raskolnikov murders somebody at the very beginning, and that's very exciting, like as he tries to escape from the police. And then the whole rest of the thing is this cat and mouse game, where he's trying to like evade, capture. And at the same time, he's not leaving the city because he doesn't really want to evade capture on one level. So the psychological level was good, but it was just like a thriller almost. It was so compulsively readable. I couldn't put it down. And that was a shock for me. I thought that classics had to be difficult. I thought they were supposed to be tough. I had this idea that literature, like good literature, high literature, had to be something that you worked for. I didn't think it should be fun, right? I didn't think that it could be fun, I should say. So yeah, reading Crime and Punishment kind of derailed the elitist wheel that was spinning in my brain and like exploded the idea that I must have like kind of absorbed of low literature and high literature. And yeah, it just taught me that reading can be fun. Who knew? So yeah, Dostoevsky taught me how to have a good time, basically. Thanks, Dostoevsky. Next book from my university reading list that makes this list is Germinal by Emile Zola. This book taught me about privilege, although like I didn't have that word. I wouldn't have used that word to describe it at the time. That wasn't like a buzzword like it is now. It's about a miners' strike. There's a specific scene in it where the miners are like rioting on the streets and they're demanding bread. There's a middle class, like upper middle class guy who we've been following the novel as well. And his wife has she left him or she's sleeping with someone else or something, but he's totally like heartbroken and he's got a sad life, right? And he's just stuck in his existence, and he's suffering because of his relationships, and he hears the people outside calling for bread, and he feels kind of irritated in a way. Like, it's like, how can you, bread is so simple, like imagine if all you had to worry about was something like bread. You didn't have to worry about these, complex emotional things like what I'm going through now, right? And reading that was a revelation for me, because I could kind of, on the one hand, see how wrong he was in his approach and his lack of empathy and his lack of relatability and like kind of his blindness. I could understand all that, but I also felt sorry for the guy, and I connected with his heartbreak, his loneliness, because when I read this, that feelings of like heartbreak and loneliness were more attractive as reading material than like class consciousness, right? I wasn't interested. I didn't know anything about class. So being able to emotionally connect with this bougie, heartbroken asshole, while at the same time getting an understanding of like the wider social picture and how he fit into it, just gave me a totally different like perspective on myself and my privilege, and like kind of how my interests and my feelings existed in a world of material, like kind of wants and needs, and some people having those needs met and some people having basic needs not met. Oscar Wilde turned me into an emo, and Emile Zola turned me into a Marxist. The late 1800s was a crazy time. And the last one, the most recent book on this list that I've read, is one of my three sacred, majestic beauties, The Metamorphoses by Ovid. This was actually also part of university required reading, like one small section about like Medusa or something, which we had to read for some course about myth, and I read it and I liked it, but that was it. But because of that course, I bought this book, right, which is quite chunky. So I had this book in my house, and I thought like I should read it one day because I paid the money for it, and like I was kind of vaguely interested in Greek myth. And then I actually just sat down and read it like years later in Japan. And like all the other books on this list, it completely changed my life. As well as it being like wonderful poetry, like really accessible as well. This is translated by David Rayburn, and like I've seen some other translations of this work, and honestly, this is always going to be the one for me, I think. Super accessible, super fun to read. Great range of like kind of love and horror and like kind of just comedy and all sorts of things just mashed together. Which makes sense because it's about metamorphoses. It's a poem about, things changing. But like, it was reading the Greek myths, because this goes through like a whole bunch of Greek myths, right? And seeing that they're all connected. Not, I always had this interesting Greek myths of like, oh yeah, there's like a Pegasus and there's like a Medusa and there's like no, the Pegasus came out of Medusa's head. Like, they're all connected. Everybody is somebody's relation, or maybe their grandfather was a guest of that person's king, or it's like everything is a tapestry of stories that have been brought together, and like it's like kind of a family saga as well. There's bloodlines which are interesting. So this had more of an effect on me than, for example, 100 Years of Solitude by Marquez, right? Like, I really enjoyed that book, and I really enjoyed, like, that was my first like real family saga that I got into, but this made me like obsessed with family sagas. This made me obsessed with drawing my own family trees on books and things like that. And unlike, The Picture of Dorian Gray and some of the other books on this list, I didn't know how much this was rewiring my brain when I read it. I liked it a lot. I thought it was fantastic, but I didn't know that it was like really doing some damage to the neurons, because now, I wake up in the morning and I think things like, what did Cadmus's daughters really think about their dad? Or, what did the beach look like that Hecuba was standing on after Troy had fallen and she'd been taken to a place where she thought she'd be reunited with her son, but only to find out that he'd been murdered, Like, things like that. Like, what was the color of the sky? Like, I just want to fill in all the details, because he provides such a wonderful universe of Greek myth here, but he also leaves gaps, and my brain has been trying to fill in all those gaps ever since I read this book, and it's great, but it also like it's how I think now. This is the oldest one on the list, right? And like, they're all crazy for me, like that these books like have had such an impact on my life, but like especially a 2,000-year-old poem like affecting how I think about things on a daily basis. Like, that's it's just crazy, right? Anyway, that is it. Those are my 10. I could have squeezed in some more here, but like, and honestly, I actually really wanted to, because I played with the idea of like including some women on this list. You may have noticed it's entirely men, but you know, my reading growing up was skewed heavily male, like not consciously. That's just like kind of what I was going for and what I was exposed to. And there are so many female writers like Angela Carter and Karen Michaelis whose books like has such a huge impact on me and like how I think about things. But if I'm being totally honest, then these 10 that I talked about are really the most, I don't know, I feel like path setting kind of books, the books that like made me act differently after I'd read them, or think differently, or behave differently, or sent me in a direction which led me to do things, which means that blah blah blah, you know. So yeah, at the moment I do feel like it's 10. That is a very convenient number for a YouTube video, but I do feel like it's actually 10 books are like head and shoulders above all the other books that have changed my life. But I hope it gets to 11. I hope it gets to 12. I feel like you get less of these kind of dynamite books as you get older. It's just like, unfortunately, how human brains work, I guess. But I'm hoping for more. I'm always looking for them. Now it's your turn. What is a book that changed your life or shaped your life, or, you know, set you on a path which determined to some extent who you are today, changed you for better or for worse? I want to know. Tell me the juicy stuff down below in the comments. I'm really curious about this. It doesn't have to be like your favorite book. Like, not all of these are my favorite books. This is one of my favorite books, but you don't really get to choose what shapes you, and that is what makes lists like these quite interesting, I think. I could have actually included one more here. I said it's definitely 10, but I think I was just thinking about this one, The Things in Moldy Manor. This is a pop-up book that I read when I was like a really small kid. And I don't really like horror novels, but I love horror movies. And I think the sort of the visual, tactile format of horror pop-up books like kind of did that to me, you know. Maybe because I loved these as a kid, but then I didn't like scary things for a very long period, and still to this day, like, I don't really like horror novels so much, although I've tried. God knows I've tried. But anyway, I should wrap up there. So yeah, I'll catch you in the next video. Bye.